Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
I'm so excited to get to read a commencement address to you. I've always been a fan of that form. Commencement addresses are a call to action, they're a reflection, they're a celebration of an achievement, given usually at this very momentous time in a person's life. And I think more than anything, what they are is really a lecture of advice, a letter of advice. And it's the kind of advice that most interests me. It's not the sort of advice where somebody is being instructed or told what to do, but rather it's advice of the Spirit. It's not what should you do, but it's how should you live, how should you be. And it asks deeper questions. It encourages the listener or the recipient of that address to reach wider and love more deeply and think in a more complex way. And so I think that that's why so many of us, when we, those commencement speeches, especially I think in the last few years, some of those that have gone viral online, that we're inspired by them even though we ourselves aren't at that moment. We're not graduating from university on that day. And so it's in that spirit I'm going to read to you a commencement address that I wrote in my capacity as Dear Sugar, which you all call an agony aunt here in Great Britain. And I got this job as Sugar in 2010. And it became this thing. When I first took it on, I thought, well, who am I to give advice? And the answer was no one. And then I realized that actually the advice form, like the commencement address, allowed me to do that very thing I just spoke of, give advice of the Spirit, take a question and make it more universal. And so in writing the column, I got all kinds of questions about all kinds of things. And one of them was from a professor at the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa. And he was a creative writing and English professor. And he and his class wrote to me. He said, look, I have all of these students who are about to graduate with majors in English, and everyone around them, the culture, their parents, everyone is saying, what the hell are you going to do with an English degree? What kind of job are you going to get? How practical is that? And he said, what can you tell them that will make them not despair? So let me just read to you this letter I wrote in response to the professor's letter. There's a line by the Italian writer Carlo Levi that I think is apt at this moment in your life. The future has an ancient heart. I love it because it expresses with such grace and economy what is certainly true, that who we become is born of who we most primitively are, that we both know and cannot possibly know what it is we've yet to make manifest in our lives. I think it's a useful sentiment for you to reflect upon now at this time, when the future likely feels the opposite of ancient, when instead it feels like a Lamborghini that's pulled up to the curb while every voice around demands you get in and drive. I'm here to tell you it's okay to travel by foot. In fact, I recommend it. Those who've read Wild know I really recommend it. There's so much ahead that's worth seeing, so much behind you can't identify at top speed. Your professor is correct. You're going to be all right. And you're going to be all right not because you majored in English or didn't, and not because you plan to apply to law school or don't, but because all right is almost always where we eventually land, even if we mess up entirely along the way. I know. I messed up some things. I was an English major too, as it happens. I lied for 6 years about having my English degree, though I didn't exactly mean to lie. I had, in truth, gone to college and participated in a graduation ceremony. I'd walked across the stage and collected a paper baton. On that paper, it said a bachelor's degree would be mine once I finished one final class. Technically, it wasn't even a class I needed to finish. It was a 5-page paper on a short story called The Nose by Nikolai Gogol. It seemed like such an easy thing to do to write that paper, but it wasn't. And so I didn't, and the years slipped past, each one making it seem more unlikely that I'd ever get my degree. I'd done all the coursework except that one class. I'd gotten good grades. To claim I had a degree in English was truer than not, I told myself. But that didn't make it true. You have to do what you have to do. You can't go to law school if you don't have any interest in being a lawyer. Faking it never, ever works. If you don't believe me, read Richard Wright. Read Charlotte Bronte. Read Joy Harjo. Read William Trevor. Read the entire Western canon. Or just close your eyes and remember everything you already know. Let whatever mysterious starlight that guided you this far guide you onward into whatever crazy beauty awaits. Trust that all you learned during your college years was worth learning, no matter what answer you have or do not have about what use it is. Know that all those stories and poems and plays and novels are a part of you now, and that they're bigger than you, and they always will be. I was a waitress during most of the years that I didn't have my English degree. My mother had been a waitress for many of the years that she was raising my siblings and me. She loved to read. She always wanted to go to college. One time, she took a night class when I was very young, and my father became enraged with her and cut her textbook into tiny pieces with a pair of scissors. She dropped the class. I think it was biology. You don't have to get a job that makes others feel comfortable about what they perceive as your success. You don't have to explain what you plan to do with your life. You don't have to justify your education by demonstrating its financial rewards. You don't have to maintain an impeccable credit score. Anyone who expects you to do any of those things has no sense of history or economics or science or the arts. You have to pay your own electric bill. You have to be kind. You have to give it all you got. You have to find people who love you truly and love them back with the same truth. But that's all. I got married when I was in college. I got divorced during the years that I was lying about having my English degree. When I met the man to whom I'm now married, he said, "You know, I really think you should finish your degree. Not because I want you to, but I can tell that you want to." I thought he was sort of being an asshole. We didn't bring up the subject again for a year. I understand what you're afraid of. I understand what your parents fear. There are practical concerns. One needs money to live. And there is the deep longing to feel legitimate in the world, to feel that others hold us in regard. I felt intermittently ashamed during my years as a waitress. I'm the only one of my siblings who went to college. I was supposed to be the one who made it. At times, it seemed instead I'd squandered my education and dishonored my dead mother by becoming a waitress like her. Sometimes I would think of this as I went from table to table with my tray, and I'd have to think of something else so I wouldn't cry. Years after I no longer worked at the last restaurant where I waited tables, my first novel was published. The man who'd been my manager at the restaurant read about me in the newspaper and came to my reading. He'd been a pretty awful boss. In fact, at times I'd despised him, but I was touched to see him in the bookstore that night. All those years ago, who would have ever guessed we'd be here celebrating the publication of your novel? He asked me when we embraced. I would have, I replied. And it was true. I always would have guessed it, even all the time that I feared it would never happen. Being there that night with my first published novel was the meaning of my life. Getting there had been my every intention. When I say you don't have to explain what you're going to do with your life, I'm not suggesting you lounge around whining about how difficult it is. I'm suggesting you apply yourself in directions for which we have no accurate measurement. I'm talking about work and love. It's really condescending to tell you how young you are. It's even inaccurate. Some of you who are graduating from college are not young. Some of you are older than me. But to those of you new college graduates who are indeed young, the old new college graduates will back me up on this. You're so goddamn young. Which means about 8 of the 10 things you've decided about yourself will over time prove to be false. The other 2 things will prove to be so true that you'll look back in 20 years and howl. My mother was young too, but not like those of you who are so goddamned young. She was 40 when she finally went to college. She spent the last years of her life as a college student, though she didn't know they were her last years. She thought she was at the beginning of the next era of her life. She died a couple of months before we were both supposed to graduate from different schools. At her memorial service, my mother's favorite professor stood up and granted her a PhD. The most terrible and beautiful and interesting things happen in a life. For some of you, those things have already happened. Whatever happens to you belongs to you. Make it yours. Feed it to yourself, even if it feels impossible to swallow. Let it nurture you, because it will. I've learned this over and over and over again. There came a day when I decided to stop lying. I called the college from which I did not have an English degree and asked the woman who answered the phone what I needed to do to get one. She told me I had only to take one class. It could be any class. I chose Latin. I'd never studied Latin, but I wanted to know at last where so many of our words come from. I had a romantic idea of what it would be like to study Latin. The Romance languages, after all, descended from it. But studying Latin was not romantic. It was a lot of confusion and memorization and attempting to decipher bizarre stories about soldiers marching around ancient lands. In spite of my best efforts, I got a B. One thing I never forgot from my Latin class is that a language that is descended from another language is called a daughter language. It was the beginning of the next era of my life, like this is yours. Years after I no longer lived in the state where my mother and I went to college, my first novel was published, and I traveled to that state to give a reading. Just as my former awful boss had done in a different city mere weeks before, the professor who granted my mother a PhD at her memorial service read about me in the newspaper and came to the bookstore to hear me read. All those years ago, who would have ever guessed we'd be here celebrating the publication of your first novel, she asked when we embraced. Not me, I replied, not me. And it was true. I meant it as sincerely as I'd meant that I always would have guessed it when I'd been speaking to my boss. That both things could be true at once. My disbelief, as well as my certainty, was the unification of the ancient and the future parts of me. It was everything I intended, and yet still I was surprised by what I got. I hope you'll be surprised in knowing at once. I hope you'll always have love. I hope you'll have days of ease and a good sense of humor. I hope when people ask what you're going to do with your English or creative writing degree, you'll say, continue my bookish examination of the contradictions and complexities of human motivation and desire. Or maybe just carry it with me as I do everything that matters. And then smile very serenely until they say, oh.
I'll just start off by asking you a couple of questions.
Sure.
The first is there a piece of advice that you've heard from somebody else, possibly at a commencement lecture or something like that, which has been powerful for you in your life?
So much of the advice I've given is sugar, or the advice I just gave in my own commencement address, or any of the good things in my life in some ways are, handed down over time. Just the same way that we get an education in the subject we study. I think we are also inspired by the people who came before us and shared their wisdom. And one of the things I heard in a commencement address that I just read, and it was by an American poet named Adrienne Rich, who I just revere. She has always really talked about in her work and written out of a place of her wounds and her sorrows and made that into something beautiful. And I find that to be very inspiring.
What are the kind of challenges for you, the ethical challenges for you in terms of believing that you are in a position to give other people advice?
I think that it has to do with repositioning that position. You know, I never, ever, ever say I'm coming from a place of authority. I really try to always establish the fact that I'm just right down there in the muck with whoever's writing to me. I mean, just in the piece I read, which is a column called The Future Has an Ancient Heart. And, you know, by way of sharing what I have to offer to these graduates, I'm also telling them, look, when I graduated, I didn't even graduate. I couldn't finish a paper. It took me years to go back and do that. And so that's in some ways really saying, I'm not an authority. I don't think that we necessarily have to get advice from people who have positions of authority. Who do we ask for advice? Our friends, our parents, strangers on the street sometimes therapists, you know. And so I think that we're all getting a range of information from a number of sources, and as Sugar, I'm simply one of those sources.
Was there anything that anybody could have said to you in the years when your life was going off track, you know, after your mother died, before you went on the walk, when things were really all over the place for you? Was there anything that anybody could have said, or was this just something you had to get through?
That's a great question. You know, I think probably not. I think sometimes we have to have a hard time. You know, when something difficult happens, when something life-changingly sad or painful happens, we suffer. And so, you know, suffering was the natural response to my mother's death at 45. And so in the midst of that, I did things that were positive and things that were negative and good for me and things that were bad for me. And, you know, I found my way through. But I would say one of the things that I feel most acutely when I look back and think, could anyone have helped me? I felt so alone, and I wasn't actually alone. I remember thinking, you know, just even though rationally I knew other people's mothers had died, I didn't know anyone who had a dead mother. And I didn't know I could seek them out. And now what's interesting is, you know, I'm like the captain of the club of the dead mothers, because everyone comes to me and says, oh my God, my mom's dead too. And you know, there are so many people who relate to my experience because it's their experience too. And I think that if I could go back in time, that would have been something that maybe made a little bit of a difference.
But the walk that you went on, the amazing hike that you went on, that's the subject of the book and the film, this had an amazing kind of cathartic effect on you. For those people who feel their life has gone off track, that they are lost in some way or another, is there something they can do which is less demanding than than nearly killing themselves?
Yeah,
but that's, in a way, that's the problem with this, is that you would never advise someone to set out like you set out, carrying far too much stuff and not really knowing what you were doing. But in a way, setting out not knowing what you were doing was part of what it was, which is this kind of paradoxical thing about advice, isn't it? That you kind of have to make the mistake to get there.
You do. That's it. I mean, I don't know if you're a parent, but it's this, you watch your children, you know you can tell them things, and you know there are things they have to learn on their own. And, you know, it's funny, because you're right, I was absolutely foolish, and I took too much stuff. But, you know, that's the most common backpacker mistake in the book. You know, I mean, not in my book, in the book of life, you know. People come to me and say, I did the same thing very few people don't do the same thing the first time they go backpacking, because we don't know what it really means to carry everything you need on your back until there you are carrying everything you need on your back, and then you realize, okay, this is crazy. And you learn by doing.
Is this a metaphor for baggage more generally?
It is. And so you learn to lighten your load, and just like you learn how to heal a broken heart, or you learn all of these things over time by doing them. And so I think it was as it had to be. I do think, back to your original question, you know, what can people do who are in the midst of some sort of strife or struggle or suffering? It doesn't have to be hiking. You know, what it was for me, if you really, you know, take the core intention, essentially, of my PCT journey, it was, how do I get myself out of this place where I'm doing all these things that are causing me to suffer more, and get myself into a place, like physically, literally, into a place where I have the opportunity to feel good again, to feel strong again. And my mother, one of the things that just absolutely drove me insane about my mother is she was very optimistic. And one of the things that she would always say, anytime you're really miserable, you know, you have the opportunity to escape that to some extent. There's always a sunrise and there's always a sunset, and you can be there. You can be present for that beauty. You can put yourself in the way of beauty, and you can have that in your life. And I would just be like, oh, Mom, you know. And then years passed, and she died, and there I was on the PCT. And every morning there was the most unbelievable sunrise, and every night the most unbelievable sunset. And I realized I had done what she told me to do. I had put myself in the way of beauty. And so I think, you know, just trying to do that, even if it's the smallest thing, can be incredibly healing.